Sometimes, life gives you second chances when you least expect them. James Porter had given up on the world, retreating into the quiet corners of his small garage. Once a teacher who inspired young minds, he was now a man weighed down by loss, isolation, and years of silence. His days were spent fixing broken engines and avoiding broken people. But everything began to change one ordinary evening on an empty road. A fateful encounter with two arrogant police officers pushed James to a crossroads. It was a moment that could have hardened him further, but instead, it set off a chain of events that would crack open his quiet, lonely world. From a kind stranger who stopped to help, to a struggling single father and his spirited little girl, and a troubled teenager searching for direction, unexpected people began to find their way into James's life. Each one brought their own struggles, their own wounds, but also small moments of kindness, hope, and trust that James hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Yet the journey wasn't easy. Old wounds reopened, tempers flared, and James would be forced to confront the parts of himself he had spent so long burying. Could he really give others a second chance when he struggled to forgive himself? The day had been long, and the night was darker than usual. The old Jeep groaned as James Porter gripped the wheel with his calloused hands. Its engine hummed, sputtering now and then, like a tired old man catching his breath. James felt the same, worn down, his years showing more in his soul than on his face. At 58, he had lived enough to know life rarely dealt a fair hand. The road was quiet, lined with crooked trees that cast thin shadows beneath the flickering streetlights. James had spent his entire day working at his small garage, patching up an old sedan that reminded him of his own Jeep barely holding on. The garage was his life now, though it was falling apart like everything else he owned. Its sign had been weathered into obscurity, and fewer customers trusted a place that looked so beaten down. But James never complained. Not to anyone. He lived alone in a creaking two-bedroom house at the edge of town. The kind of house no one noticed the paint peeling, the roof patched by his own two hands, and the porch sagging from years of neglect. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. Framed photos sat gathering dust on the mantel, frozen smiles of people who had long since disappeared from his life. His wife, gone for 10 years. His grown son, estranged and distant. James had grown used to the silence. He told himself it was better this way. As he drove along the empty road, his thoughts drifted like they often did. He replayed memories of brighter days, back when he was a high school shop teacher, showing kids how to build engines and repair broken things. He remembered the way they looked up to him, eager to learn. Those days felt like another lifetime. The sudden flash of headlights in his rearview mirror snapped James out of his thoughts. A police cruiser loomed closer, its lights off, just a dark silhouette against the night. James's stomach tightened. The cruiser sped up, pulling alongside him. For a moment, he glanced over and saw the faces of two young officers, their expressions smug, their intentions clear. "Not tonight," James muttered under his breath, gripping the wheel tighter. The cruiser shot ahead of him suddenly, swerving into his lane without warning. James hit the brakes hard, but the Jeep lurched. The wheels squealed, and the metal guardrail scraped against his bumper with a sickening crunch. The Jeep jolted to a stop, the engine sputtering and groaning before dying altogether. James sat there, gripping the wheel, his breath coming in short bursts. He checked himself over nothing broken, just shaken. Outside, the cruiser pulled over. Two doors opened, and the officers stepped out casually, as if they had just wrapped up a coffee break. "Whoa, easy there, buddy," said the taller one with a name badge that read Todd Miller. His voice dripped with mockery. "What's the rush? This is not a racetrack." James took a deep breath and unbuckled his seatbelt. He climbed out of the Jeep, his tall frame standing straight despite the ache in his knees. His weathered face remained calm, but his jaw tightened. "You forced me off the road," James said, his voice steady but firm. What is this about? The other officer, Ryan Carter, younger and cockier, leaned against the hood of their cruiser, smirking. Relax, old man. We just wanted to make sure you were okay. You looked like you didn't belong out here. James's eyes narrowed. Didn't belong? Todd shrugged, his smug smile never fading. You know how it is. Sometimes we have to check things out. For public safety, of course. James ignored the bait. Years of experience had taught him that men like this thrived on provocation. Instead, he walked to the front of his Jeep, inspecting the damage. The bumper was bent, the paint scraped off, and the hood dented. It was nothing he could not fix, but it was the principle of it all. Gentlemen, James said evenly, standing tall, you just damaged my vehicle. I suggest you explain yourselves. Ryan let out a low whistle, shaking his head in mock amusement. Listen to this guy, Todd. Thinks he is in charge. Todd stepped closer, his smile disappearing. Why don't you let us see some ID? And while you are at it, pop the trunk. Just routine. James's patience was thinning, but he stayed calm. He reached into his back pocket and handed over his worn driver's license. Todd snatched it up, holding it under the cruiser's headlights. James Porter, he read aloud, dragging out each syllable. What brings you out here so late, Mr. Porter? Driving home from work, James replied, his voice even. Ryan, meanwhile, circled the Jeep like a vulture. Without waiting for permission, he opened the back door and began rummaging through James's belongings. He pulled out an old gym bag and tossed it aside, followed by a stack of papers James had neatly packed earlier. Hey, James snapped, his voice sharp now. That is my property, Ryan chuckled. Relax, it's just a little search. Nothing to hide, right? James clenched his fists at his sides, willing himself to stay composed. Every fiber of him screamed to push back, to demand they stop, but he knew better. He had seen men like this before, men who abused their authority, who saw power as a weapon rather than a responsibility. After what felt like an eternity, Todd finally tossed James's license back at him. You're clear, old man. Guess tonight is your lucky night. Ryan slammed the Jeep's door shut, grinning. Better fix that bumper. Wouldn't want people thinking you can't drive. James said nothing as the two officers climbed back into their cruiser, still laughing. They drove off, their tail lights disappearing into the dark. For a long moment, James stood there, his breath steadying. The night was silent again, except for the hum of distant crickets and the faint rustle of the wind. He turned back to his Jeep, crouching down to inspect the damage closer. The familiar ache in his knees returned, but he ignored it. As he stood up, headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. James squinted against the light. The car slowed as it approached, and then it pulled onto the shoulder just behind him. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She looked to be in her 40s, with kind eyes and a warm smile, despite the exhaustion on her face. Her scrubs told him she was likely a nurse. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but concerned. James straightened, surprised. "I'm fine, ma'am. Just a little car trouble." She walked closer, peering at the Jeep's damage. "That looks like more than a little trouble. What happened?" James hesitated. "A misunderstanding, I suppose." She gave him a knowing look, but did not press. "Do you need a ride somewhere? It's late, and it doesn't look like that Jeep is going anywhere tonight." James hesitated again. He was not used to accepting help. It felt strange, as if he were imposing. "That is kind of you, but I'll manage." She crossed her arms, her tone gentle but firm. "Look, I'm heading into town. The least I can do is give you a ride. It's not safe to stand out here alone." James studied her face, searching for any sign of insincerity, but there was none. There was only genuine kindness. Finally, he gave a small nod. "All right," he said quietly. "Thank you." She smiled. "Name's Helen Grant. Hop in." James climbed into her car, the soft hum of the engine a welcome sound after the silence of the road. As they drove, Helen chatted lightly, asking about his work and sharing stories of her long night at the hospital. James found himself listening, the warmth of her voice oddly comforting. When they pulled up to his house, Helen handed him a small card with her name and number. "If you need help with anything, rides, repairs, whatever, just call. People need to look out for each other." James stared at the card, something stirring in his chest that he could not quite name. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now. Helen smiled. "Take care, Mr. Porter." As her car disappeared down the road, James stood on his porch, looking down at the card in his hand. For the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar: hope. He looked up at the night sky, the stars clearer than they had been in years. "Maybe things can change," he whispered to himself, and for the first time in a long time, he believed it. James woke up early the next morning, though his body begged for more rest. Years of manual labor had made his back ache every morning, but he had grown used to it. The faint hum of birds outside and the filtered sunlight through the worn curtains filled the room. For a few moments, the memory of the previous night felt distant, like a bad dream. But as soon as he moved, his muscles reminded him, and the image of his battered Jeep returned. Pushing himself up from the bed, James ran a hand through his graying hair and sighed. His small bedroom was tidy but barren. No pictures, no decorations, just the essentials. The second room of his house sat empty, once belonging to his son. Now a place where dust gathered without complaint. He walked into the kitchen, which was just as quiet as the rest of the house. The old coffee pot sputtered as it brewed, filling the air with its faint bitterness. James sat at the small table, staring down at the business card Helen had given him the night before. Her name and phone number were neatly printed in a simple font. Helen Grant, RN. James turned the card over between his fingers, a habit he had whenever something lingered on his mind. Helen's kindness was something he had not expected. For years, he had come to believe the world was a place where people took more than they gave, where looking out for yourself was the only rule that mattered. Yet here was someone who had stopped, who had offered help without wanting anything in return. The thought unsettled him as much as it comforted him. Setting the card down, he finished his coffee in silence. A quick glance out the window revealed his Jeep parked crookedly at the edge of the driveway, its front bumper crumpled like an old soda can. It looked worse in the daylight. He grabbed his keys and stepped outside. The air was cool and crisp, the town still half asleep. The Jeep groaned in protest as James tried to start it. After a few attempts, he gave up and opened the hood, examining the damage. The guardrail had not just bent the bumper, it had shifted the radiator slightly, and a faint hiss told him the coolant was leaking. He could fix it, but it would take time, parts, and energy. He had all the time in the world, but not the rest. As James leaned over the engine, the sound of a car pulling up broke his concentration. He straightened and turned to see a familiar vehicle, a silver sedan. Helen stepped out, her scrubs replaced with jeans and a sweater, her hair tied back loosely. "Morning," she called, smiling. She held a paper cup of coffee in one hand. "Figured you might need a little something to start your day." James blinked, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Helen shrugged as she walked up the driveway, handing him the coffee. "I was driving by on my way to run errands, and I saw the Jeep. Thought you could use a second pair of eyes. Looks like you've got your hands full." James took the coffee, unsure how to respond. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said simply, glancing at the crumpled Jeep. "Looks like you had a rough night." James sighed, nodding. "It's nothing I can't handle. Just needs a little work." Helen raised an eyebrow, leaning against the side of the Jeep. "And you're planning to do it all on your own?" "That's how it's always been," James replied, his voice rough but not unkind. Helen tilted her head, studying him. "You don't strike me as the type to ask for help, but maybe that's something you should think about." James stared at her for a moment, before shaking his head lightly. "I don't like being a burden to people." Helen smiled faintly. It's not a burden to lend a hand. People need each other sometimes. It's how we get through life. James didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't used to this kind words, concern, someone showing up for him. For so long, life had been a quiet routine of fixing cars, paying bills, and keeping his head down. Helen's presence, though unexpected, made him feel seen in a way that unsettled him. "I can give you a ride into town if you need parts for this," Helen offered, nodding toward the Jeep. "My schedule's open for the morning." James hesitated. He wanted to refuse, to stick to the solitude that had become his shield. But Helen's kind smile softened the stubbornness that had kept him isolated for so long. "Maybe a ride to the parts shop," he said finally, his voice gruff but grateful. Helen grinned. "Sounds good." As they drove into town, Helen filled the silence with light conversation. She told James about her years working as a nurse, about her family who lived a few states away, and how she had moved to this small town only a few years ago. She liked the slower pace, she explained, but sometimes it got lonely. James found himself listening, absorbing her words. He had forgotten what it was like to have a conversation that didn't revolve around broken cars or overdue bills. Helen never pried, but she asked questions that made him feel like she actually cared. "What about you?" she asked, as they pulled into the parking lot of the auto shop. "What about me?" "Your story," Helen said, turning to face him. "What did you do before you ran your garage?" James looked out the window, his jaw tightening slightly. He didn't like talking about the past, but something about Helen made him feel safe enough to answer. "I was a teacher," he said finally. "Shop class. Worked with kids who needed a little extra guidance, taught them how to fix engines and build things with their hands." Helen's expression softened. "That's amazing. What made you stop?" James paused, his gaze still fixed outside. "Life happens." Helen seemed to understand that was all he would say for now. She didn't press. "Well, those kids were lucky to have someone like you." James turned back to her, surprised by her words. No one had said something like that to him in years. He cleared his throat. "Thanks." Inside the shop, James picked up the parts he needed, paying for them with a tight budget he had carefully managed over the years. Helen waited patiently, occasionally chatting with the man behind the counter as if she knew him for years. James noticed how naturally people seemed to like her. As they headed back, Helen stopped at a diner on the edge of town. "How about breakfast?" "My treat," she offered. "You've done enough already," James replied. "Humor me," she said, her tone light. They sat in a corner booth, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. James ordered a simple plate of eggs and toast, but the food tasted better than anything he had eaten in weeks. As they ate, Helen talked about her life in town, her work, and the people she had met along the way. She spoke with warmth and kindness, like someone who saw the good in everything. James mostly listened, but as the conversation continued, he found himself sharing bits and pieces of his own story. He talked about his wife, about his garage, and even about his estranged son, how they had fallen out years ago and hadn't spoken since. "I guess some things just can't be fixed," he said quietly. Helen shook her head. "Sometimes the hardest things to fix are the ones that matter most. But that doesn't mean you stop trying." Her words lingered in James's mind as they drove back to his house. When Helen dropped him off, he stood by her car, feeling a strange sense of gratitude he didn't quite know how to express. "Thank you, Helen," he said finally, "for everything." She smiled. "You're welcome, James. Take care of that Jeep, okay?" As her car disappeared down the road, James stood on his porch, holding the new parts in his hands. The day felt different, somehow lighter. Helen had done more than give him a ride. She had shown him that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry everything alone. For the first time in a long time, James felt something stir in his chest, a small ember of hope. The morning sun broke through the clouds as James Porter stepped out onto his sagging porch, a cup of coffee cradled in his hands. The cool air was sharp, but pleasant, and for a moment, the silence felt peaceful. Helen's words from the previous day lingered in his mind. People need each other sometimes. It's how we get through life. James glanced at the battered Jeep still parked awkwardly in the driveway. The new parts he had picked up yesterday were stacked neatly in his garage, waiting for him. Normally, he would throw himself into a repair job without hesitation, letting the rhythm of work distract him. But today, James stood still, his thoughts unusually restless. He took a sip of his coffee and rubbed his jaw, squinting toward the yard next door. The property had been emptying for years, its paint peeling and grass growing wild. Last week, he had seen a moving truck parked out front, and a man unloading furniture with a little girl hopping around at his feet. He hadn't thought much of it then. Now, as James stared across the yard, he spotted the same little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing a yellow coat and chasing a butterfly. Her laughter carried faintly on the wind, breaking the quiet. A moment later, her father stepped outside, holding a wrench and wiping his hands on a rag. "Come on, Maddie, we've got work to do," the man called out, his voice cheerful. James turned back toward his garage, intending to get started on his Jeep. As he walked, the neighbor's voice carried over again. "Hey there!" James stopped and turned slowly. The man waved at him, smiling. He was younger, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair and a rough-around-the-edges look, but his expression was open and friendly. The little girl, Maddie, clung to her father's side, peeking shyly around him. "Morning," James said, his voice gruff but polite. "Sorry to bother you," the man said, walking closer and extending a hand. "I'm Caleb Watson. Just moved in last week." James glanced at Caleb's outstretched hand for a beat too long before finally shaking it. Caleb's grip was firm, but James noticed the calluses, a working man's hands, just like his own. "James Porter," he replied. Caleb nodded, still smiling. "Nice to meet you, James. Listen, I hate to ask, but I'm in a bit of a jam. My car won't start, and I'm no mechanic. Someone in town mentioned you run a garage?" James nodded, his gaze flicking briefly to Caleb's old sedan, parked crookedly in the driveway. "That's right. Been fixing cars most of my life." Caleb looked relieved. "Would you mind taking a look? I'd really appreciate it." James hesitated. Part of him wanted to decline, to bury himself in his own work and let the rest of the world figure itself out. But then he glanced at Maddie, still clinging to her father's side, staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. Something about the innocence in her face chipped away at his stubborn resolve. "Bring it over here," James said finally, jerking his chin toward his garage. Caleb's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you. I'll push it over now, if you give me a minute." 10 minutes later, Caleb and James were both crouched over the engine of the old sedan. James could tell right away that it was a simple fix, a dead battery connection, but he let Caleb watch as he worked, explaining the problem in as few words as possible. Caleb listened closely, nodding and asking questions that made it clear he was trying to learn. "You know," Caleb said as James tightened a bolt, "I used to work construction, so I'm decent with my hands. Cars, though, not my strong suit." James grunted in acknowledgement. "Not much to it once you know the basics." Caleb chuckled. "Maybe you can teach me sometime. Looks like you've got the magic touch." James allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile as he finished up. He straightened and wiped his hands on a rag, gesturing toward the ignition. "Give it a try now." Caleb climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered for a moment before roaring to life. Caleb whooped in victory, slapping the steering wheel. Maddie, who had been sitting quietly on the front steps, cheered loudly. "Daddy, you fixed it," she called, her voice bright and excited. Caleb climbed out of the car, grinning as he extended a hand to James. "Nah, Mr. Porter here's the real hero." "Thank you, James. I owe you one." James shook his head. "No trouble at all. It was an easy fix." Caleb looked at him thoughtfully, tucking his hands into his pockets. "I know money's tight for us right now. I can't pay you what you deserve, but I'm handy around the yard if you need help. Mowing, repairs, whatever you need." James opened his mouth to refuse, but Caleb continued, his voice earnest. "It's the least I can do. My little girl needs a reliable car, and you've done us a big favor." James hesitated. He was not used to this trading favors, accepting help, but as he glanced at Maddie, who was still beaming, something in him softened. "Yard could use some work," James said finally, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Do what you can when you've got time." Caleb smiled wide. "Deal." That afternoon, James found himself watching from the garage as Caleb pushed an old lawnmower across his overgrown yard. The steady hum of the motor filled the air, and for the first time in months, the property looked like someone actually cared about it. Maddie, meanwhile, ran circles around her father, pretending to chase butterflies again. As James worked on his Jeep, he could hear Caleb talking to Maddie, teasing her about her butterfly-chasing skills and asking for supervisory approval of his mowing job. "You're doing great, Daddy," Maddie giggled. James caught himself smiling faintly at the sound. He quickly shook it off, focusing back on the engine in front of him. The hood of his Jeep reflected the cloudy sky above, but something about the day felt brighter than usual. An hour later, Caleb walked up to the garage, wiping sweat from his brow. "That should do it for today. I'll come back tomorrow and finish up." "You didn't have to do all that," James replied, though he was quietly impressed by Caleb's hard work. "I did," Caleb said firmly. "A deal's a deal." As he turned to leave, Maddie skipped up beside him, holding a small, crumpled piece of paper in her hand. She extended it toward James, her expression proud. "What's this?" James asked, taking the paper carefully. "It's a picture I drew," Maddie said shyly. "It's you fixing cars. Daddy said you're really good at it." James unfolded the paper and looked at the crayon drawing a stick figure version of himself next to a bright red car. There was even a small "thank you" scrawled at the bottom in shaky letters. For a long moment, James did not know what to say. He looked at Maddie, her face full of hope and innocence, and then back at the drawing. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice catching in his throat. "This is real nice." Maddie beamed, her little face lighting up with joy. "You're welcome." Caleb smiled at his daughter before turning back to James. "We'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Porter. Thanks again for everything." James watched them walk back to their house, Maddie chattering happily at her father's side. As he stood there in the fading afternoon light, the crayon drawing still in his hand, he felt something stir deep inside him. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there, a warmth he had not felt in years. Maybe Helen had been right. Maybe people did need each other after all. James carefully folded Maddie's drawing and placed it on his workbench, where it sat like a quiet reminder of something he could not quite name. James woke the next morning to the sound of Caleb's lawnmower sputtering to life outside. He sat up in bed, listening to the familiar hum grow steady. Sunlight spilled through the thin curtains, brightening the room more than James cared for. With a low groan, he swung his legs off the bed and sat there for a moment, his back stiff and aching. The house, as always, was quiet. James had lived alone long enough that the silence no longer bothered him. Most days, it was preferable. But lately, with Caleb and Maddie next door, there was noise, a kind of life that James was unaccustomed to. He washed up quickly and made his way to the kitchen. A faint smell of fresh grass drifted in through the window, carried by a soft breeze. Outside, Caleb worked steadily, cutting the patchy, overgrown lawn with the same determined energy he had the day before. Maddie sat cross-legged on the porch steps, her small figure swaying as she hummed to herself. James poured himself a cup of coffee and stared out the window. He could see Caleb stop and wipe the sweat from his brow before looking toward the garage, as if checking to see whether James was awake. James smirked faintly, muttering to himself. persistent guy. By the time James stepped outside, Caleb had finished half the yard, and Maddie had moved on to drawing chalk flowers on the sidewalk. Caleb turned off the mower as James walked up, his face breaking into a grin. "Morning, Mr. Porter," he said, brushing his hands off on his jeans. James nodded in greeting, looking at the trimmed grass. "You didn't have to come back today." "A deal's a deal," Caleb replied, straightening up. "Besides, it's good exercise." James raised an eyebrow. "Good exercise or just free childcare for Maddie?" Caleb chuckled, nodding toward his daughter. "A little of both, I guess. She's been asking about you, by the way." James glanced at Maddie, who was kneeling on the sidewalk with her chalk, tongue poking out as she concentrated on a large yellow sun. She caught him looking and waved excitedly. "Hi, Mr. Porter," she called out. James gave a small wave back. "Morning, Maddie." "She's a handful," Caleb said, his voice softening. "But she keeps me grounded." James stared at Caleb for a moment, hearing something unspoken in his words. The young man seemed tired beneath his cheerful exterior, like someone carrying more weight than he let on. James knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough. "You work today?" James asked, nodding toward the house. "Not until this evening," Caleb replied. "I've been picking up shifts at the hardware store." "You manage all this raising her, working part-time, taking care of the house on your own?" Caleb shrugged. "You do what you have to. It's just me and her now, so I don't have much of a choice." There was no bitterness in Caleb's voice, just quiet resolve. James respected that. "Come by the garage later," James said abruptly. "I've got an old lawnmower engine lying around. Maybe I'll show you how to fix it. Could come in handy." Caleb's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. "Seriously? I'd appreciate that. Maddie will get a kick out of it, too." James grunted, pretending to focus on the trimmed grass as he tried to hide the flicker of warmth he felt. "We'll see how long her interest lasts." That afternoon, Caleb and Maddie showed up at the garage just as James had started tinkering with the Jeep again. Caleb carried Maddie's favorite stuffed rabbit under his arm, which the little girl claimed she couldn't leave behind. "Hope you don't mind company," Caleb said, as Maddie skipped into the garage, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Just don't let her touch anything sharp," James replied, gesturing toward his workbench. Maddie ran straight to the crayon drawing she had made him the day before, which James had propped up on the wall. "Look, Daddy, he put it up." James shot Caleb a look, his voice gruff. "It was a nice drawing." Caleb grinned knowingly. "She's got talent." James ignored him and handed Caleb the lawnmower engine he had pulled from an old shelf. "Here, first thing we're going to do is check the spark plug." As Caleb followed James's instructions, Maddie darted around the garage, stopping occasionally to ask questions about random tools. James answered her questions with the kind of patience he hadn't realized he still possessed. Her endless curiosity reminded him of the kids he used to teach, kids who wanted nothing more than to figure out how things worked. "You must have been a great teacher," Caleb said suddenly, breaking James's thoughts. James paused mid-turn of a wrench, his eyes narrowing. "Who told you that?" Caleb shrugged. "No one. Just a guess. You've got a way with explaining things. I'd bet you were good at it." James didn't respond right away. He set the wrench down carefully and glanced over at Maddie, who had moved on to playing with a roll of electrical tape as though it were a magic toy. "Teaching was a different time," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Things change." "Doesn't mean it's too late," Caleb said, his tone casual but pointed. James didn't answer. He turned back to the engine, but Caleb's words lingered in his mind. Later that evening, after the sun had started to dip below the trees, Caleb and Maddie packed up to head home. James watched as Caleb carried the fixed lawnmower engine, Maddie skipping beside him with her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. "Thanks for the lesson, Mr. Porter," Caleb said, nodding to him. "We'll see you tomorrow?" James grunted in response, though a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Don't let the kid paint my garage with chalk," Caleb laughed. "No promises." As they left, James stood in the garage doorway, staring out into the fading light. The faint sound of Maddie's giggles carried over as Caleb lifted her into his arms, their silhouettes growing smaller as they disappeared into the house next door. The garage felt quiet again. Too quiet. James turned and looked around the space. The tools, the old engines, the dusty workbench, they were all familiar, but for the first time in years, they felt hollow. Caleb's words replayed in his mind. "You must have been a great teacher." James exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his jaw. He used to love teaching, watching kids learn, seeing their faces light up when they solved a problem that used to give him purpose. Somewhere along the way, after his wife passed and his son grew distant, that purpose had faded. He walked over to the workbench and picked up Maddie's crayon drawing, running his thumb lightly over the words, "Thank you." For the first time in years, something stirred inside him. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was close. James folded the drawing carefully and set it back in its spot on the wall. An hour later, James was in the kitchen, reheating leftover stew on the stove when there was a knock at the door. It was soft but insistent. James frowned, wiping his hands on a towel as he made his way to the door. When he opened it, Caleb stood there, Maddie half asleep in his arms. Caleb looked sheepish, as though he hadn't meant to bother him. "Sorry for stopping by so late," Caleb said. "We made a little extra tonight and thought you might like a plate. Maddie wanted to make sure you got some before bed." James blinked, looking down at the tin foil-covered plate Caleb held out. It was still warm. "I didn't ask for this," James said gruffly, though he didn't pull away. "I know," Caleb replied, "but sometimes people need a little kindness. You can't fix everything alone, right?" James took the plate slowly, his throat tight. Maddie stirred and murmured something sleepily against Caleb's shoulder. "Thank you," James said, his voice quieter than usual. Caleb nodded and turned back toward his house. "Good night, Mr. Porter. Sleep well." As James closed the door, he stood there for a long time, the warm plate in his hands and a lump in his throat. Sometimes people need a little kindness. He sat down at the kitchen table, the food in front of him, and for the first time in years, James Porter felt like someone cared. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of James's kitchen as he sat at the small table, staring down at the empty plate from last night's meal. He had reheated Caleb's offering chicken and rice, nothing fancy, but it tasted better than anything James had made for himself in years. Kindness, unasked for and unexpected, was something he still had trouble swallowing. It gnawed at him in an unfamiliar way, stirring thoughts he had spent years locking away. James pushed himself up from the chair, carrying the clean plate to the sink. Through the kitchen window, he caught sight of Maddie playing in the yard next door, her yellow coat standing out against the dew-covered grass. Caleb was nearby, working on something with his usual focus, though James couldn't tell what it was. He turned away from the window, pushing the nagging feeling of gratitude out of his mind. He had things to do, repairs waiting, bills needing to be paid. James grabbed his worn flannel jacket, picked up his keys from the hook by the door, and stepped out onto his porch. The day passed quietly at the garage. James busied himself under the hood of a customer's pickup truck, letting the steady rhythm of work keep his thoughts in line. He liked it best this way, just him, the hum of tools, and the familiar smell of grease and metal. It gave him something to focus on, something he could fix. By late afternoon, hunger gnawed at him, reminding him that the last thing he'd eaten was a slice of toast at sunrise. With a grumble, James washed his hands, shrugged off his dirty work gloves, and decided to head to the diner on the edge of town. The small diner was a place James had visited for years, though not often. It was quiet most days, tucked between a hardware store and a gas station. its faded red sign blinking weakly above the entrance. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and stale pie crusts, all blending into something oddly comforting. James stepped through the door, the bell above it jingling softly. The place was almost empty, save for a few regulars tucked into corner booths and a young couple sharing milkshakes by the window. James nodded a quiet greeting to the owner, Carl, a burly man with a mustache who waved from behind the counter. "Coffee and the special?" Carl called out, already scribbling James's order on a notepad. James gave a small grunt of confirmation and slid into a booth near the back. He liked this spot. From here, he could see the whole diner while keeping his back to the wall, a habit born from years of preferring solitude. As he waited, James stared out the window, his mind wandering. He thought about Maddie's drawing still hanging in his garage, Caleb's persistence, and Helen's words. People need each other sometimes. It was starting to feel like the whole world had conspired to remind him of something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The sound of the bell above the door ringing again broke James's thoughts. He glanced up just as a familiar figure entered Officer Todd Miller. James tensed slightly, his jaw tightening on instinct. Miller strolled in like he owned the place, his uniform crisp, his face stretched into its usual smug expression. Behind him followed Officer Ryan Carter, the younger of the two, chewing gum loudly and looking equally arrogant. They didn't notice James at first, but when Miller turned toward the counter, his gaze landed on the far booth. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. James stared back, unflinching. Miller smirked and said something to Carter, who snickered as they sat at the counter. James heard Miller's voice carry over the hum of the diner, too loud to be casual. "I swear, you'd think some folks don't know their place," Miller said, stirring his coffee lazily. Carter chuckled. "What, like old man Porter? He's still got that clunker, right?" James clenched his fists under the table, his knuckles whitening. He'd heard men like them before, people who used their authority like a weapon. As James stared down at the chipped tabletop, a soft voice startled him from his thoughts. "Refill for you, Mr. Porter." He looked up to see Shirley, the diner's oldest waitress, standing next to his booth with a pot of coffee. Shirley was a frail woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She'd been working here as long as James could remember, her movements slow but steady. "Sure," James muttered, sliding his mug toward her. Shirley poured the coffee carefully, her hands trembling slightly. When she finished, she smiled kindly. "Haven't seen you in here in a while. How's that garage of yours holding up?" "It's holding," James replied, his voice softening slightly. Shirley had always been one of the few people in town who treated him with quiet respect. "Good to hear," she said warmly. Her words were cut off by the clatter of a coffee cup hitting the counter. Across the room, Officer Miller leaned back in his stool, laughing loudly. Shirley startled, her face paling as she turned toward the commotion. "Careful there, Shirley," Miller said with mock concern, his voice carrying across the small diner. "You're getting shaky with that coffee pot. Maybe it's time to retire." Ryan Carter snickered beside him, his laughter sharp and cruel. Shirley's face flushed, and her hands shook even more as she clutched the empty coffee pot to her chest. She tried to smile, but it wavered. "Sorry, officers. Maybe next time you'll remember not to spill anything on my uniform," Miller added, sneering. James watched the scene unfold, his stomach twisting. The diner's hum faded to silence as everyone else pretended not to hear, their heads down and eyes fixed on their food. Shirley's shoulders slumped as she turned back toward the kitchen, her steps slow and unsteady. James's chest tightened as he looked at the two officers laughing at the counter. He knew he could stay quiet, he always had before. But something about Shirley's face, about her trembling hands, struck a nerve. Without fully thinking, James pushed his chair back and stood up. The soft scrape of his boots against the floor caught Miller's attention. The officer's smug smile faltered slightly as James approached the counter. "Something funny?" James asked, his voice calm but firm. Miller's smirk returned, though it looked less confident now. "What's it to you, Porter?" James didn't look away, his gaze steady. "You're out of line. She's just doing her job." Miller scoffed, shaking his head. "Relax, old man. No need to make a scene." James's voice remained even, though there was a quiet steel behind it. "You've made enough of one already." The diner had gone completely silent now. Even Carl had stopped wiping the counter to watch. Miller's face flushed slightly as he glanced around, realizing all eyes were on him. Carter muttered something under his breath, but James ignored him. Instead, he turned toward the kitchen, where Shirley hovered nervously in the doorway, her face pale. "You all right, Shirley?" James asked, his tone soft. Shirley gave him a weak smile, her voice trembling. "I'm fine, Mr. Porter." "Thank you." James nodded once, then turned back toward his booth without another word. The officers stayed quiet after that, their laughter gone. James could feel Miller's eyes on him as he sat back down, but he didn't care. A moment later, Carl placed James's plate of food in front of him, giving a quiet nod of approval before walking away. When Shirley returned to refill his coffee one last time, she smiled faintly, though her eyes shone with gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Someone had to," James replied simply. As James finished his meal and paid at the counter, he glanced back to see Shirley standing a little straighter, her steps steadier as she moved between tables. He stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, the sound of the diner's bell jingling faintly behind him. For once, James didn't feel like a man lost in his own silence. Sometimes standing up wasn't about making noise, it was about doing the right thing, quietly and firmly, when no one else would. The sun was low in the sky as James pulled back into his driveway. The old pickup he had borrowed from Carl rattled as it came to a stop. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel, and stretched his back. The quiet of his house greeted him like always, but something about today felt different. James had never been the kind of man to stick his nose into other people's business. Life had taught him long ago that standing out came at a price. But at the diner, seeing the officers humiliate Shirley had struck a nerve that ran too deep to ignore. As he locked up the truck and headed toward the garage, James's eyes drifted to Caleb's yard. The young man was perched on a ladder, fiddling with a loose gutter on the side of his house, while Maddie ran barefoot through the grass below, her laughter carrying across the space between them. "Daddy, be careful," Maddie called out, tilting her head back to watch him. "I've got it, kiddo," Caleb replied, though the ladder wobbled slightly under his weight. James shook his head, smirking to himself. He didn't intend to get involved, but his instincts got the better of him. "Ladder's leaning too far out," James called, his voice carrying over the yard. Caleb startled slightly, looking over. "Oh, hey, Mr. Porter, you think so?" "I know so," James replied, stepping closer to the fence that separated their properties. "You're about one bad gust of wind from breaking your neck." Caleb laughed, though he looked sheepish as he climbed down the ladder. "Guess I'm still figuring out this home repair stuff." "Looks like you're figuring it out the hard way," James muttered, though his tone was more amused than gruff. "You need a proper ladder or some help?" Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans and grinned. "Both, probably." James didn't say anything for a moment, his gaze shifting to Maddie, who had stopped running to stare at him. She smiled shyly. "Hi, Mr. Porter." James gave her a small nod before turning back to Caleb. "Come by the garage tomorrow. I'll lend you some tools and show you how to get that gutter fixed right." "Really?" Caleb asked, surprised. "That'd be great." "Yeah," James replied. "Might as well teach you how to do it before you burn the house down." Caleb laughed, not taking the jab personally. "I'll take you up on that." The next morning, the sound of tools clinking echoed through James's garage as Caleb watched closely, his brow furrowed in concentration. James worked on an old lawnmower engine that he had pulled apart for Caleb to practice on. Maddie sat nearby on a stool, her little legs swinging back and forth, happily scribbling in a coloring book James had dug up from a box of old things. "Hand me that ratchet," James said, gesturing toward the tool tray. Caleb grabbed the tool and handed it over, watching as James tightened a bolt with practiced ease. "I don't know how you keep all these parts straight," Caleb said with a shake of his head. "It's not as complicated as it looks," James replied, his voice steady. "Engines are like anything else. You fix the small things, and the big things take care of themselves." Caleb nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Wish life worked like that." James paused for a beat, glancing up at Caleb. "Sometimes it does. You just have to know what you're looking for." Caleb seemed to take that in, but before he could respond, Maddie piped up from her corner. "Mr. Porter, can I see what you're fixing?" James looked over, surprised. He hadn't expected Maddie to be interested. "Sure," he said after a moment, stepping aside. "Come take a look." Maddie hopped off her stool and skipped over, standing on her tiptoes to peer at the engine. James leaned down slightly, pointing out a few parts. "This here's the spark plug. It helps the engine fire up. And this is the carburetor, keeps the fuel running through." "Carburetor?" Maddie repeated, wrinkling her nose. James smirked faintly. "Close enough." She smiled wide, clearly proud of herself. Caleb grinned at his daughter. "See that, Maddie? You're learning from the best." James felt a strange warmth stir in his chest. It was the same feeling he used to get back in the classroom, watching a kid's face light up when they finally understood how something worked. "You want to try turning this bolt?" James asked Maddie, holding out the ratchet. Her eyes widened. "Really?" "Just don't lose the bolt," James said, though his tone was gentle. Maddie beamed and took the tool carefully. James guided her small hands, showing her how to tighten the bolt without stripping it. She giggled as she worked, clearly thrilled to be helping. "You're a natural," James said quietly when she finished. Maddie's smile was as bright as the sun. "Daddy, did you hear that? I'm a natural." Caleb laughed. "You sure are, kiddo." James stood up, stepping back to let Maddie admire her work. Caleb looked over at him, a curious expression on his face. "You ever think about teaching again?" James froze for half a second before shaking his head. "Those days are behind me." "Doesn't mean you're done helping people," Caleb said. "I've learned more from you in 2 days than I have in months on my own." James didn't respond. He busied himself cleaning a tool, but Caleb's words struck a chord deep in his chest, one he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Later that afternoon, after Caleb and Maddie had gone home, James sat in the garage alone, staring at the old chalkboard that hung on the back wall. It had been there for years, left over from a time when he would scribble notes and diagrams for the neighborhood kids who came by for repairs. Most of the chalk had crumbled away, but a faint drawing of an engine block remained one of the last lessons he had taught before his life fell apart. James's thoughts drifted to Caleb and Maddie, to Shirley at the diner, to Helen and her kindness. For years, James had convinced himself that the world had nothing left for him, that his only purpose was to fix cars and keep to himself. But things were changing now, whether he wanted them to or not. Caleb's persistence, Maddie's innocence, and Helen's encouragement were chipping away at the walls James had spent so long building. He rubbed his thumb over a faint grease stain on his hand, staring at the chalkboard. "Maybe you're not done helping people." Caleb's words replayed in his mind, and for the first time in years, James let himself consider the possibility that he might have something left to give. The next morning, James found himself outside Caleb's house, a wrench in his hand. Caleb was halfway up the ladder again, fixing the last section of the gutter. "Need a hand?" James called out, smirking. Caleb looked down, surprised, but pleased. "Didn't expect to see you out here so early." "Thought I'd make sure you don't break your neck," James replied, walking closer. Maddie appeared from around the corner, holding a small plastic toolbox that was nearly as big as she was. "Mr. Porter, Daddy said I can help today." James crouched down, eyeing her seriously. "You think you're ready for the big leagues?" Maddie nodded vigorously, her pigtails bouncing. "Then let's get to work," James said, his voice lighter than it had been in years. As Caleb climbed down the ladder and Maddie proudly handed him tools, James felt something shift inside him, something quiet but real. The walls he had spent so long building were starting to crack, and the light was beginning to shine through. The following days brought a rhythm James hadn't known in years. Caleb and Maddie were fixtures around his garage now, always showing up with something to fix, a question to ask, or just a smile to share. Caleb's genuine determination to learn and Maddie's endless curiosity chipped away at the solitude James had built so carefully. But even as he worked alongside them, teaching Caleb how to mend engines and showing Maddie the difference between a wrench and a socket, James felt the stirrings of something deeper, something uncomfortable. He couldn't shake the feeling that people like Caleb and Helen were pulling him back into the world he had turned his back on. For years he'd accepted that life had given him nothing but loss. His wife's passing, his son's silence, it all seemed to say the same thing. People leave, and there's no sense in holding on. Now, these small, unexpected acts of kindness were beginning to suggest otherwise. It was a Saturday morning when Helen's silver sedan pulled into the driveway. James, who was fixing the back latch on Caleb's trunk, squinted against the sun as she stepped out, holding a paper coffee tray and a bag that smelled like fresh pastries. "Am I interrupting?" Helen called out with a warm smile. "Not if you brought coffee," Caleb replied from under the hood of his car. Helen laughed, handing Caleb and James each a cup. Maddie skipped out from the garage, holding a small rag stained with grease. "Miss Helen!" Maddie shouted, running up to her. "Well, good morning, Maddie." Helen crouched down to hand her a pastry, which Maddie accepted as though it were the greatest treasure she'd ever received. James took the cup of coffee with a quiet grunt of thanks, eyeing Helen warily as she leaned against the hood of Caleb's car. "You're out early." "Thought I'd stop by and see how my favorite mechanics are doing," she replied, sipping her own coffee. "You've got quite a crew here now, James." James snorted softly, though his lips twitched with the hint of a smile. "Don't remind me." Helen's expression grew more serious. "Actually, I stopped by because I have a favor to ask." James raised an eyebrow, his instinctive suspicion kicking in. "What kind of favor?" Helen hesitated, looking toward Maddie, who was now busy eating her pastry on the porch steps. "There's a kid I want you to meet," she said finally. James's brow furrowed. "A kid?" "His name's Terry Johnson," Helen explained, her voice softer now. "He's 17, just out of juvenile detention. He's had a tough go of it, bad choices, bad influences, but I think there's hope for him. He's been struggling to find work, and I thought, maybe you could give him a chance here at the garage." James stared at her, the words hanging in the air like smoke. "Helen, I'm not running a charity. This garage barely keeps itself afloat as it is." "I know," Helen said patiently, "and I wouldn't ask if I didn't think it mattered. Terry doesn't need handouts. He needs someone to show him the ropes. Someone like you." James looked away, the old, familiar tension creeping into his shoulders. He didn't need this. He had enough on his plate, enough people poking at the life he'd carefully stitched together. "What's it got to do with me?" he muttered, focusing on the rusted edge of Caleb's trunk. Helen's voice was gentle, but firm. "Because you know what it's like to lose your way. And you know how much it matters when someone gives you a second chance." James flinched slightly, though he didn't let it show. He hated how well Helen seemed to see through him. "You don't have to decide now," Helen added, standing up straight. "I'll bring him by tomorrow. Just talk to him, James. That's all I'm asking." Without waiting for an answer, she turned back to her car, waving to Maddie and Caleb as she climbed inside. James watched her drive off, a pit settling in his stomach. The next afternoon, James sat in the garage, staring blankly at a half-finished engine on the workbench. Caleb was off with Maddie, running errands in town, leaving the garage unusually quiet. It was the kind of silence James usually welcomed, but today it pressed against him like a weight. Helen's words echoed in his mind. "You know how much it matters when someone gives you a second chance." He didn't want to think about it, but the truth was impossible to ignore. Years ago, when James had hit rock bottom after losing his wife, it had been someone else, a fellow teacher at the high school, who gave him a reason to keep going. Back then, James had been just as angry, just as lost as this kid Helen mentioned. But someone had believed in him. That was the thought turning over in his mind when Helen's car pulled into the driveway. James wiped his hands on his rag and stepped outside, his expression guarded. Helen climbed out first, followed by a lanky teenager who moved like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. Terry Johnson had shaggy brown hair that fell over his eyes and hands stuffed deep in his pockets. His clothes were worn, and there was a hardness about him, a look James recognized. Helen smiled warmly. "James, this is Terry. Terry, this is Mr. Porter." Terry mumbled a quiet, "Hey," without looking up. James crossed his arms, taking the kid in. "You ever worked in a garage before?" Terry shrugged. "No, sir." James raised an eyebrow. "You know anything about cars?" "Not really," Terry admitted, his voice barely audible. James sighed, his first instinct telling him this was a waste of time. "And why should I take a chance on you?" Terry finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting James's. There was no bravado there, just raw honesty. "Because no one else will." The words hit James harder than he expected. For a moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Helen stood quietly nearby, letting the silence hang. After a long beat, James turned and gestured toward the garage. "You'll start by sweeping the floor. Tools are organized on the wall. Don't touch anything unless I tell you. You show up on time, you work hard, and we'll see where it goes." Terry blinked, his guarded expression faltering. "You mean it?" James shot him a sharp look. "Don't make me regret it." Helen's face lit up with relief as she clapped Terry on the shoulder. "You won't regret this, James. I promise." James grunted, already turning back toward the garage. "We'll see." That afternoon, Terry swept the garage floor with quiet determination, his movements careful and deliberate. James worked nearby, glancing at the teenager every so often. Terry didn't complain, didn't stop to check his phone, or slouch around like James had half expected. When Terry accidentally knocked over a wrench, James's voice cut through the quiet. "Keep your hands steady. This isn't a playground." "Sorry," Terry mumbled, quickly picking it up. James softened slightly but didn't let it show. "You'll get the hang of it." As the day wore on, Caleb stopped by with Maddie, both of them surprised to see Terry working. Caleb raised an eyebrow at James, smirking knowingly. "Hiring help now, huh?" "Don't start," James muttered, though a faint grin tugged at his lips. Caleb laughed and clapped Terry on the back as he passed. "Welcome to the team, kid." By the end of the day, Terry had swept every corner of the garage, spotless. As he dusted his hands off, he looked up at James. "Thanks for this, Mr. Porter. I won't screw it up." James met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "See that you don't." Terry nodded and left with Helen, who gave James a proud smile before driving off. James stood in the doorway of the garage, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. For the first time in years, the place didn't feel empty. As he looked at the freshly cleaned floor, James realized something he hadn't dared admit before. Sometimes giving someone else a second chance meant giving yourself one, too. The following week brought a shift in the garage, subtle but undeniable. James Porter found himself with more help and more company than he'd had in years. Caleb came by almost daily, still learning his way around tools and engines. Maddie, with her bright curiosity and cheerful chatter, had become something of the garage's mascot. And then there was Terry Johnson, the wiry teenager whose quiet determination surprised James more and more with each passing day. Terry arrived early every morning, broom in hand and ready to work. He didn't talk much, but James preferred it that way. The kid listened, learned quickly, and most importantly, stayed out of trouble. James had started giving him small tasks, organizing tools, oil changes, even teaching him how to identify parts on a disassembled engine. Terry's cautious confidence grew with each lesson, and though James didn't say it aloud, he was beginning to feel proud of the boy. But James also knew something else: Terry was carrying a weight. It was there in the way his shoulders hunched when he thought no one was looking, or how he flinched slightly whenever someone raised their voice unexpectedly. James had seen it before, in himself and in the kids he used to teach. Terry was fighting a battle, and James had a feeling it wasn't over yet. It was late one afternoon when the quiet hum of the garage was interrupted by the sound of a familiar engine outside. James recognized it immediately: a police cruiser. The air seemed to shift as James straightened up from the engine he'd been working on. Terry, who had been sweeping near the doorway, froze. His eyes darted nervously toward the sound as the cruiser pulled up alongside the garage. Two figures stepped out. Officer Todd Miller led the way, his usual smug grin plastered across his face. Behind him, Ryan Carter trailed like a shadow, chewing his gum loudly as always. "Afternoon, Porter," Miller drawled, his voice carrying into the garage. James's jaw tightened, but he kept his face calm. "Officers." Miller's gaze swept the garage lazily, his expression predatory. "Didn't know you were hiring help these days. Business must be booming." James said nothing, wiping grease from his hands as he turned to face them fully. Behind him, Terry stepped back instinctively, his broom forgotten in his grip. Miller's sharp eyes landed on the boy. "Well, look who it is," he said, his grin widening. "Terry Johnson. Didn't expect to see you here." Terry's face paled, but he stayed silent, staring at the ground. James's voice was low but steady. "You've got no business here, Miller." "Relax, Porter," Miller replied, feigning innocence as he stepped into the garage. "We're just checking in on things. Routine visit, you know. Gotta make sure everyone's staying out of trouble." Carter snickered, his gaze flicking toward Terry. "Yeah, Terry here's been on our radar before. Hope you're keeping him in line, Mr. Porter." James's eyes narrowed, his hands clenching at his sides. "He's working here. That's all you need to know." "Working, huh?" Miller said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You sure about that? Seems like a bad bet if you ask me." James stepped forward, putting himself between Terry and the officers. His voice remained even, though there was no mistaking the steel behind it. "You've said what you came to say. Now leave." Miller's smug grin faltered just slightly, but he didn't back down. He stared James down, as if daring him to say more. "Keep an eye on him, Porter. Some people don't change." With that, he turned and walked back to the cruiser, Carter following close behind. The car engine rumbled to life, and they drove off, leaving a tense silence in their wake. James turned to find Terry standing rigid, his fists balled tightly at his sides. The boy's face was pale, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Hey," James said, his voice softer now. "You, all right?" Terry nodded stiffly, though his jaw was clenched. "I'm fine." James wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't have to explain anything to me, but I'll tell you one thing. What those men think doesn't matter. It's what you do that counts." Terry looked up, his dark eyes flashing with anger and something else: shame. "What if they're right? What if I can't change?" James stared at him for a moment, his own past flickering in his mind like an old reel of film. He remembered those exact words, the doubt, the frustration, how they had gnawed at him after he lost his wife and everything fell apart. "They're not right," James said firmly, "but you've got to decide that for yourself. Nobody else can do it for you." Terry swallowed hard, his expression torn between anger and confusion. Finally, he nodded once and picked up the broom again, sweeping as though his life depended on it. James watched him for a moment longer before turning back to the engine he had been working on. His hands moved over the parts automatically, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He didn't know the full story behind Terry Johnson, what choices had led him to that juvenile detention center, or what ghosts haunted him now. But James did know this. Everyone had a choice, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise, and he wasn't about to give up on the boy. That evening, after Caleb and Maddie had left for the day and Terry had quietly gone home, James sat alone in the garage, the air cooling as the sun dipped below the horizon. He stared at the old chalkboard in the corner, where faint smudges of past lessons remained. For years, James had avoided getting involved, telling himself that it was easier to stay out of other people's lives. The weight of his past had been enough to carry. But now, with Terry working in the garage and Caleb and Maddie showing up day after day, those walls he'd built were beginning to crumble. He reached for the piece of chalk that still sat on the edge of the board. Hesitating only a moment, James scrawled a single word across the smudged surface. Trust. He stood back, staring at the word. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Terry arrived at the garage right on time, his expression guarded but focused. James greeted him with a nod, handing him a toolbox. "Today you're learning how to change brake pads," James said, his tone matter-of-fact. Terry's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope breaking through his guarded demeanor. "You trust me to do that?" "Not yet," James replied, smirking faintly. "But you're going to earn it." Terry's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles as he followed James to the truck they were working on. The day passed quickly, filled with the clink of tools and the low hum of conversation. James found himself teaching Terry in the same calm, patient way he had once taught his students. The kid was rough around the edges, but he listened, he tried, and he worked harder than most adults James had known. By the time the afternoon sun dipped low, Terry had successfully changed his first set of brake pads under James's watchful eye. As he wiped the grease from his hands, he looked up at James. "Thanks," Terry said quietly, "for giving me a shot." James nodded, his voice steady but softer than usual. "Keep showing up. That's all it takes." Terry gave a small nod, his shoulders a little straighter than they had been before. As the boy packed up for the day, James glanced back at the chalkboard, the word trust staring back at him like a silent promise. For the first time in years, he realized that giving someone a chance to grow also gave him the chance to heal. The weather had been threatening rain all morning. Heavy gray clouds loomed low over the town, the kind of sky that promised a storm that wouldn't pass quickly. James stood outside the garage, arms crossed, watching as the wind rustled the trees along the road. He could feel it in his bones, the kind of damp chill that settled deep and stayed there. Inside, Terry was organizing the tool wall, a task James had assigned earlier that morning. He'd come in without hesitation, on time as always, ready to work. The kid was shaping up, James thought. His shoulders were squarer these days, his eyes a little less guarded. Caleb pulled up a few minutes later in his beat-up sedan, Maddie in the passenger seat clutching a book to her chest. She waved as soon as she saw James, her little face lighting up despite the dark sky overhead. "Hey, Mr. Porter," Maddie called as she hopped out of the car, wearing her yellow raincoat and polka-dot boots. "Daddy says there's gonna be a big storm." Caleb climbed out with a groan, stretching his back. "The kind that knocks trees over, I'd bet." James nodded, glancing at the horizon. "You might be right. Storm like this can take out power for days if it's bad enough." Terry poked his head out of the garage. "Want me to start bringing tools in? Keep them dry?" James gave him an approving nod. "Good idea." As Terry disappeared back into the garage, James turned to Caleb. "You got everything you need at the house? Extra water, batteries?" Caleb sighed. "Not really. I was gonna head to the store, but half the shelves are probably empty by now." James frowned. "You've got Maddie to look after. If you need anything, you come here. Understood?" Caleb smiled faintly, clapping James on the shoulder. "Appreciate that, Mr. Porter." Maddie's voice piped up, cheerful as ever. "It'll be fun, like camping." James smirked, shaking his head. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that, kid." By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the garage windows. Rain pelted the ground in sheets, turning the road outside into a shallow river of mud and water. James worked quietly with Terry to cover any exposed tools and seal up the doors as tightly as possible. "You ever seen a storm like this?" Terry asked, his voice a little tense. "Once or twice," James replied, "the kind you don't take lightly." Outside, Caleb's car rolled up again, this time faster, splashing through puddles. When he stepped out, his face was tight with worry. Maddie followed close behind, holding tightly to her stuffed rabbit. "Power's out at the house," Caleb said, raising his voice to be heard over the rain. "I figured we'd ride it out here if you don't mind." James waved him inside without hesitation. "You don't need to ask." As Caleb and Maddie hurried into the garage, James grabbed an extra heater he kept in the corner and set it up near the workbench, where it would keep the cold at bay. Caleb set Maddie down on a crate, draping his coat over her shoulders as she clutched her rabbit tightly. "Daddy, it's loud," she whispered, her wide eyes darting to the garage door as the wind howled. Caleb crouched beside her, brushing damp hair from her face. "It's just wind, sweetheart. Nothing to be scared of. We're safe here." James watched them for a moment, his chest tightening faintly. He remembered nights like this from years ago, storms that had rattled the windows of his old house, when his wife would sit with their son, reading him stories to calm his nerves. It had been so long since those days, but watching Caleb with Maddie brought the memories back, sharp and clear. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need," James said quietly. Caleb looked up, gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks, James. Means a lot." The hours dragged on as the storm raged outside. The garage lights flickered but held steady, powered by an old generator James kept running out back. Caleb had brought in a small box of snacks he'd grabbed from his house: granola bars, crackers, and water bottles, which they shared between the four of them. Terry sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting bolts and washers into their proper containers. James noticed the boy's hands were steady, but he glanced toward the windows more often than usual. "You all right?" James asked softly, sitting on a crate nearby. Terry hesitated before answering. "Storms remind me of stuff." James nodded, understanding without pressing. "It's just weather, kid. Nothing here's gonna hurt you." Terry gave a small nod, though his expression remained tight. "Hey, Terry!" Maddie called out suddenly, her voice cutting through the low hum of the generator. "Want to color with me?" Terry glanced over at the little girl, who was kneeling on a blanket Caleb had spread out for her. She held up a set of crayons and a small notepad, her face bright and hopeful despite the storm outside. For a moment, Terry looked like he might refuse, but then he pushed himself to his feet and walked over, sitting cross-legged on the blanket as Maddie handed him a crayon. "Blue's my favorite," she said matter-of-factly, pointing at the crayon he'd grabbed. Terry's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles. "Mine too." James watched the scene unfold, a lump forming in his throat. Terry, who had been so guarded, so closed off, was now carefully coloring a cartoonish sun beside Maddie. Caleb noticed it too, glancing toward James with a small, knowing smile. "Storms bring out strange things in people, huh?" Caleb murmured. James grunted softly. "Sometimes for the better." By nightfall, the storm had begun to ease. The wind still howled, but it no longer screamed against the garage doors, and the rain had slowed to a steady rhythm. James sat at the workbench, staring into a steaming mug of coffee Caleb had brewed on a portable stove. The garage felt almost peaceful now. The only sounds, the soft hum of the generator and Maddie's giggles as she showed Terry her latest drawing. "You've got a good thing here, James," Caleb said quietly, leaning against the bench beside him. James looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Caleb gestured around the garage, the neatly organized tools, Terry helping Maddie, the old heater humming in the corner. It's not just a garage anymore. It's a place where people belong." James stared into his coffee, not sure how to respond. For so long, he'd seen the garage as nothing more than a place to work, a way to keep himself busy, to pass the time. But Caleb wasn't wrong. Slowly, without him realizing it, the garage had become more than that. It had become a refuge for Caleb, for Maddie, for Terry, and maybe even for himself. "You're the one who brought them here," James said finally, his voice low. Caleb smiled faintly. "Maybe, but you're the one who kept them here." James looked over at Maddie and Terry again. The boy was laughing softly now, something James hadn't seen him do before. Maddie beamed as she showed him how to draw a perfect cloud, her small hands waving dramatically in the air. For the first time in a long time, James felt something like peace settle over him. The storm outside had passed, and the storm inside him, well, maybe it was starting to clear too. That night, after Caleb and Maddie had fallen asleep on makeshift blankets, and Terry had dozed off on an old couch in the corner, James sat alone in the quiet garage. The air smelled faintly of oil and rain, and the silence felt warm instead of empty. He looked at the chalkboard hanging on the back wall, the word "trust" still scrawled across it. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe this place had become something more, something worth holding on to. James picked up the piece of chalk and added another word beneath it: hope. He stared at the board for a long moment before setting the chalk down. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and the first stars were beginning to break through the clouds. For the first time in years, James Porter let himself believe that the worst storms didn't last forever. The storm had passed, leaving the town washed clean under a pale morning sun. Puddles pooled along the road outside, reflecting blue sky and wisps of thin white clouds. The garage smelled faintly of damp concrete and warm engine oil, but the air inside felt lighter than it had in years. James stood at the workbench, wiping down tools with his steady hands. The rhythmic movement felt comforting, simple, clear, and controlled. Behind him, Caleb and Terry were rolling up the makeshift bedding they had used the night before, chatting quietly. Maddie sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully coloring another picture with crayons scattered around her. For once, everything felt right. Caleb looked over, his grin easy and relaxed. "You know, James, not many people would have opened up their doors like you did last night." James snorted softly, shaking his head. "Wasn't much of a choice with a kid in the storm." Caleb smirked. "Well, you make a terrible grump when you try to act like you don't care." James shot him a look, though there was no real bite to it. Caleb laughed and went back to folding his coat. It was Terry who spoke up next, his voice quiet but clear. "Thanks, Mr. Porter, for letting us stay here." James paused, setting down the wrench he had been cleaning. He turned to face Terry, who stood near the couch with his hands in his pockets. The boy looked taller somehow, less hunched, less unsure of himself. "Don't mention it," James said gruffly. "You earned it by showing up." Terry nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Maddie piped up from the floor, holding up her newest drawing triumphantly. "Look, Mr. Porter, it's us." James stepped closer to see the picture. In her bright, unsteady crayon strokes, Maddie had drawn the garage. There were 4 stick figures: him, Caleb, Terry, and herself, smiling under a big yellow sun. Above it, she had written in block letters, "The Garage Family." James felt his throat tighten as he stared at the picture. He wasn't sure why the simple drawing struck him the way it did, but something about it made his chest ache. A family. He hadn't thought of the garage that way, hadn't dared let himself, but Maddie had seen it clearly, the way only a child could. Caleb clapped a hand on James's shoulder, breaking the silence. "Looks like you've got yourself a crew, Mr. Porter." James swallowed the lump in his throat, giving a small grunt of acknowledgement. "Seems that way." That afternoon, with the storm gone and the town waking up, Caleb and Maddie headed home to check on their house. James sat outside the garage, enjoying the quiet hum of life returning to normal. Terry lingered nearby, tightening the bolts on a tire James had asked him to work on. "You've done good work this week," James said suddenly, his voice carrying across the space. Terry glanced up, startled, before nodding quickly. "Thanks." James leaned back in his chair, studying the boy for a moment. "You thought about what you're gonna do next?" Terry hesitated, fiddling with the ratchet in his hand. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Helen's been trying to get me to look at trade schools, but—" "But what?" James prompted. Terry exhaled, his voice small. "I don't know if I can do it. If I'm good enough." James frowned. "Why not?" Terry shrugged, looking down. "I've messed up a lot, Mr. Porter. People like me, they don't get second chances." James let out a long breath, the words hitting him harder than he expected. For a moment, he saw himself in Terry, the same doubt, the same weight of past mistakes. He knew exactly how it felt to carry that around, day after day. "You think you're the first person to mess up?" James said, his tone calm but firm. "You're not. What matters is what you do now, not what you've done before." Terry looked up, his expression unsure. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," James continued. "You show up, you work hard, and you've got the guts to admit when you don't know something. That's more than most people can say." Terry blinked, clearly surprised by the compliment. "You think I could actually make something of myself?" James nodded slowly. "If you want it bad enough, yeah. But you've got to do the work." Terry stared at him for a long moment, before nodding, determination flickering in his eyes. "I'll think about it." "Good," James replied, his voice softer now. "And when you decide, I'll help you figure it out." Terry's face lit up just slightly, like someone who'd finally been given permission to believe in himself. By the end of the week, life at the garage had settled into its new rhythm. Caleb had finally patched up his gutters. Maddie had taken to calling herself James's assistant, and Terry showed up every day with a little more confidence than the day before. James found himself watching all of it with quiet pride. For years, the garage had been a place where he worked alone, fixing cars and shutting out the world. Now it felt alive, a space filled with laughter, learning, and the kind of connection James had forgotten he needed. One afternoon, as James was finishing up a repair, a familiar silver sedan pulled into the driveway. Helen stepped out, her warm smile familiar as always. "You're becoming quite the busy man, James," she teased, glancing toward Terry, who was carefully checking tire pressure nearby. "Don't start with me, Helen," James muttered, though the corner of his mouth twitched. Helen leaned against the workbench, her gaze soft. "You've made a difference here, you know. Terry's been talking about applying to that trade program I mentioned." James paused, surprised. "He tells you that?" Helen nodded. "Said Mr. Porter thinks he can do it, so maybe he should try." James grunted, though the pride he felt was unmistakable. "Kid's got potential, just needs someone to remind him." Helen smiled knowingly. "Sometimes we all need someone like that." She turned to leave, but before climbing back into her car, she glanced back at him. "You've done a good thing here, James, whether you see it or not." James watched her drive off, the words settling into his chest like a quiet truth. That evening, As the sun set and painted the sky orange and pink, James sat outside the garage, watching the last bit of light fade. The tools were put away, the day's work done. Caleb and Maddie had gone home, and Terry had waved goodbye after another long day. James took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. He glanced up at the chalkboard in the garage, where two words were scrawled now: trust, hope. For the first time in years, James Porter allowed himself to believe that the road ahead was no longer empty. His garage, once a place of solitude, had become something more, something worth holding on to. And as the stars began to blink to life overhead, James smiled faintly to himself. Sometimes the hardest things to fix weren't engines or cars, but people. And in fixing others, you just might find a way to fix yourself. Months had passed since the storm, and life at the garage had taken on a rhythm James never could have imagined. It was no longer just a place to fix broken cars. It was a place where people found second chances, where trust was rebuilt, and where hope quietly grew. Terry had just finished his first semester at the local trade school. He still worked at the garage on weekends, determined to learn as much as he could. Every time James saw the kid roll up his sleeves and get to work, he felt a flicker of pride, a reminder that small changes could lead to something bigger. Caleb had become more than just a neighbor. He was a partner in the garage now. With his growing skills and steady reliability, he had helped James take on more work, and for the first time in years, business was thriving. Maddie, of course, was always close by, her bright drawings now taped up all over the garage walls. On a warm afternoon, James sat outside the garage, a cup of coffee in hand. He watched as Caleb tightened a bolt on a customer's car, while Terry explained something to Maddie, using her stuffed rabbit as a stand-in for an engine part. Maddie giggled, her laughter ringing out like a bell. James smiled faintly, feeling that familiar warmth settle in his chest. The road he had been on, one of loneliness and quiet resignation, had led him here, to something better than he had dared to hope for. It had taken kindness from unexpected places to bring him back. Helen's encouragement, Caleb's persistence, Maddie's innocent joy, and Terry's hard work had all reminded James of a truth he had long forgotten. Sometimes, when you help fix others, you fix yourself too. Standing, James stretched his stiff back and stepped toward the garage. "Terry, you finished checking that oil pan?" Terry nodded, grinning. "All done, Mr. Porter." "Good. Maddie, don't let him overcharge you for that rabbit repair," James teased, earning a giggle from her and a playful eye roll from Terry. Caleb glanced over with a smirk. "Careful, James. You're getting soft on us." "Don't start," James grumbled, though there was no real edge to his voice. As he stood there, surrounded by the sounds of work and laughter, James knew the road ahead would have challenges. But he wasn't walking it alone anymore. The garage, once a place of rusted parts and forgotten tools, had become a home. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, kindness, and second chances, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that change is possible, and hope can be found in unexpected places. Hit that subscribe button so you won't miss future stories of growth, perseverance, and the quiet strength we all carry inside. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes it just takes a little trust and hope to turn things around. See you in the next one.